Paula at beginninggenealogist.com. Hope you're having a good day today. I want to talk about something that's actually resulted from a conversation that I had with someone recently. And it really started as what I guess was an assumption to why an individual was a little bit reluctant to even try to research their family history. And what I'm referring to is really, as I said, an assumption. And many times people don't realize there's an awful lot to your family history that's waiting for you to go and document. The point is that it's all about the records. Now, I talked about assumptions. What kinds of assumptions do people make? I've heard people say, well, I really can't research my family history because they didn't keep records on my family, or they didn't keep records on my community. They didn't keep records on my people, on my ethnic group, what have you. This is an assumption, and it's a mistaken assumption. Another example, well, I researched my family a little bit, but I know I can't use military records because my grandfather did not serve in World War II, or my great-grandfather didn't serve in World War I. I've heard others make an assumption that, well, I wish I could find ancestors who were in military records, but I know my people were not in the Civil War, and so none of those records are going to be useful for me. Well, as I said, it's important also that you plan your research strategy, and you've heard me say that. But it's also important to understand the records and what they offer. Let's go back to an assumption, and I've heard people say this before. I've even heard people say this in my family years ago when I was first researching one of my family lines, and I was speaking with an elder, and I had a hard time finding one of my families, and I asked an elderly cousin why I couldn't find Amanda Young. I found her daughter Harriet, I thought. I found her daughter Violet, I thought, but they had a different surname. And she just said, don't worry, you're not going to find these folks because they didn't put African American families in the census. Wow. Thank goodness I didn't listen to that, because I had been looking at census records anyway. But as we went on in our conversation, and I mentioned a family that I had found with the surname Barr that seemed to have had some of our other relatives in the household, but the last name was different, and she was very hesitant and said, gee, I wonder why they did that, because only Elijah had that last name. Of course, I went back and pulled up the record, and there was Elijah in the house. What she didn't realize was that her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, had remarried after the war, and for many years was enumerated in the census with her second husband. And as a result, the entire household was enumerated as such. The head of the house was Mr. Barr, and so the wife and children subsequently were enumerated by that name, although her older children were from a previous marriage, which is why I couldn't find them with the name Young. But there was the mistaken assumption that they didn't keep census records on black families. How certainly incorrect that assumption is. But let's look at another example. One knows perhaps from family history that an uncle served in World War I, but a grandfather didn't, and the grandfather was the brother to that uncle. So there's nothing to be found in military records. Well, again, it's all about the records, but it's important to know what the records actually include and what were the laws that affected your ancestors. Well, it was actually required that all men of a certain age register for the draft, whether they served or not. The result, there are a lot of pieces of information about men who were able-bodied, men who were not able-bodied, but who still were required to register for the draft. And those draft cards, thankfully, exist, and one can look at those draft cards to find other pieces of information about the family. And what's exciting is that sometimes on those military draft records, you can find information on civilians. For example, I found, looking up a particular family in northern Alabama, I was able to find where the person indicated not only who they were, where they are, you get a physical description of that individual, but the nearest relative. And who was the nearest relative? The person's mother. In another case, it was the person's spouse, and that spouse's name is listed there. So a lot of people don't realize that it is about the records, and you should look at those records to really see what they hold. Another example where I know individuals have been surprised to learn that military records had information about their family actually comes from certain Civil War records that are categorized as military records, although the individuals described are not individuals who were soldiers. I'm referring, for example, to the large numbers of individuals who were civilians during the Civil War. Well, in many of those records, you will find records that pertained to the service or servicing or providing service to, I'll say, those individuals who were civilians. There is a tremendous record set, Record Group 105, and I may do a video in the future completely about Record Group 105, but because of the holdings, they're just tremendous and can't be described enough. But in Record Group 105, which are records that come from a bureau many people know as the Freedmen's Bureau, but don't be thrown off course by that name. The Freedmen's Bureau was actually officially known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Refugees and freedmen are the operative words. These records were created within a military context because the individuals who were providing services to the refugees and to the freedmen, to the former slaves, they were military individuals. These individuals were soldiers. These were individuals who had established field offices in the various offices throughout the South, and those refugees, who many were not people of color, were not of African ancestry, there were many white families that were also served by the Office of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. So that's Record Group 105. It's a military record. 9/10 of the individuals' names that you're going to find in that record set, although it's military, are going to be civilians. So as you plan your research strategy, it's important that you really do some homework in advance to determine what to put on your list. You are going to create that checklist, that list of vital records that you want to get, birth, death, marriage on the various individuals, beginning, of course, in the 20th century and working back. You want to think, well, what were some of the military confrontations in which the nation was involved? Yes, my goodness, there was Korea, World War II, World War I, Spanish-American War, the Indian Wars out in the western states. There was, of course, the Civil War that engulfed so much of the country in the mid-19th century. But as opposed to just thinking, the Civil War just involved soldiers, there were individuals whose lives were affected by the war who were never in the military. There were individuals who were civilians. There were refugees. There were freedmen. And so many of those records are found within those record sets as well. Become familiar with the records, learn what they are, add them to your checklist, and be careful not to void or be careful not to make those assumptions. Remember, it's all about the records, so study those records, learn what they are, and you'll be on your road to success. Good luck with your research. Let me hear from you. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.